25 cents. That's what a photograph of him cost. For a little more, he'd cut a button off his own coat and sell you that too. 18 years earlier, the United States Army had put 5,000 soldiers in the field to catch this man. He had 18 fighters plus some women and children. 5,000 soldiers for 18 people, across a desert the Army didn't know and he did. His name was Geronimo, Chiricahua Apache, born in what's now the Arizona-New Mexico borderlands. In 1851, Mexican soldiers raided his camp and killed his mother, his wife, and his 3 children. He spent 35 years fighting Mexico, then the United States, then both. He surrendered in 1886, and the government shipped him to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. One thing about the rest of his life, because the whole chapter lives inside it, he asked repeatedly to go home. To the specific place he was born, the answer was always no. He was still asking when he died. So he sat at a fair inside a rope line selling pictures of himself to people who'd come to see the West, while being forbidden to enter the actual West he came from. Somebody drew that line. Somebody in an office hundreds of miles away with a pen. That's this whole chapter. Lines drawn by people who'd never seen the land, enforced on people who'd never left it. Every section is about one of those lines. Who drew it, who had to live inside it, and what happened when it moved. This is chapter 15. This is the line. Start with the land, because the land is the part everyone skips. The Great Plains are semi-arid. Enough rain in an average year for short grass, not enough for trees. Not enough most years to feed a family off a small plot of ground. Somebody said this out loud, early, with data. In 1878, the geologist John Wesley Powell reported to Congress on the arid lands of the West, and his conclusion was blunt. Past the eastern edge of the plains, rainfall would not reliably support agriculture. He recommended farms of around 2,500 acres, 4 square miles, so a household would have enough marginal land to survive the dry years. Congress was handing out plots of 160 acres. It kept handing them out. Now the myth bust. The West was not settled by self-reliant people who asked nothing of anyone. The West was the largest federal development project of the 19th century. Washington gave free and cheap land to settlers and to mining, lumber, and railroad companies. It subsidized mail and military hauling. It paid soldiers to remove the people already living there. It installed territorial governors and judges. Without all of that, there's no homestead to be rugged on. The money wasn't even all American. British investors poured tens of millions into cattle operations alone, and far more into railroads. The self-made Western rancher was frequently working land financed in London, because the railroad is the main character. In 1862, Congress handed railroad companies enormous blocks of public land. Lay track on it or sell it to fund construction. The Central Pacific built east from Sacramento with thousands of Chinese workers. The Union Pacific built west from Council Bluffs, Iowa, with large numbers of Irish workers. In May 1869, the crews met in Utah and drove a golden spike. Here's the number that makes it real. A wagon train took 6 to 8 weeks to cross the West. The train took 6 days. Everything downstream reorganizes around that new math. Who moves, what ships, whose land becomes valuable, and whose becomes a route. It also produced a signature American swindle. Union Pacific executives set up a fake construction company, Crédit Mobilier. It also produced a signature American swindle. Union Pacific executives set up a fake construction company, Crédit Mobilier. And the country told itself a different story anyway. This image was printed everywhere, a glowing woman in white drifting west. Stringing telegraph wire, pioneers behind her, native people and bison fleeing into the dark at the left edge. Look at what's missing. No Congress, no land grant, no railroad corporation, no army. The government that made it possible does not appear in the country's favorite picture of itself. Now, about Powell being right. The Colorado River supplies 7 states and Mexico. The rules dividing that water, the 2007 shortage guidelines, the 2019 drought agreements, expire at the end of 2026. And the Bureau of Reclamation gave the 7 basin states until February 14, 2026, to agree on replacements. They missed it. So on July 31, 2026, the federal government released its own framework through 2036, because the states couldn't agree among themselves. In roughly the 26th consecutive year of drought, a federal official put it plainly: the river no longer reliably produces enough water for everything built around it. That's Powell's report, arriving 148 years late, addressed to 40 million people. The line on the map, "this many acre-feet to you, this many to you," got drawn during an unusually wet stretch by people who assumed wet was normal. The land never agreed to those numbers. It still hasn't. Before any of this, the land had people on it, not a scattered few, dozens of nations, with territories, languages, economies, and foreign policies of their own. And the United States initially treated them as what they were: sovereign nations. That's why the mechanism was treaties. In 1851, the first Treaty of Fort Laramie set boundaries for Northern Plains nations, meant to keep settlers off their land. And a second agreement extended similar terms south 2 years later. The tribes kept their side. American miners walked straight through the boundaries. And essentially nothing happened to them. On November 29, 1864, roughly 700 Cheyennes and Arapahoes under Chief Black Kettle camped at Sand Creek under assurances of U.S. protection. Colonel John Chivington attacked anyway. Black Kettle raised a white flag. The troops killed about 270 people, mostly women and children, and mutilated the bodies. A congressional investigation later confirmed it in detail. Nothing changed. In 1868, after 2 years of hard fighting led by the Lakota, a second Treaty of Fort Laramie gave northern nations the Great Sioux Reservation. Then prospectors found gold in the Black Hills, inside the territory that treaty had just guaranteed. The government didn't remove the miners. It pressured the tribes to give up more land. General William Tecumseh Sherman had ordered war against hostile Indians until they were, in his phrase, obliterated or beg for mercy. In November 1868, Lieutenant Colonel George Custer took him at his word and attacked a Cheyenne village. In 1876, the Lakota killed Custer and his troops at the Little Bighorn, their last major victory, because the army answered with an offensive that broke their resistance for good. In 1877, Chief Joseph led the Nez Perce on a 1,400-mile retreat. Troops caught them 40 miles from the border. The Apache leader Victorio refused a reservation entirely and explained why. "It is better to die fighting than to starve." Here's the part that surprises people. Those treaty lines aren't historical trivia. Several are legally operative right now. In July 2020, the Supreme Court decided McGirt versus Oklahoma. The question: had Congress ever actually dissolved the Muskogee Creek Nation's reservation? The court read the statutes and found none of them contained language disestablishing it, so the reservation still exists. So roughly the eastern half of Oklahoma, including Tulsa, is legally Indian country, and has been the entire time. Justice Gorsuch opened the opinion with a sentence worth memorizing. On the far end of the Trail of Tears was a promise. Oklahoma spent years trying to get that overturned and failed, so the lines held. Not because anyone honored them, because a 19th century Congress, busy taking everything else, forgot to write one specific sentence. Military defeat isn't really what happened here. 3 things did the work. The first was disease, and it arrived long before the army. By 1870, smallpox had killed roughly half the population of the Plains nations. That was 3 centuries of contact compounding. The second was industrial capacity. The tribes had skilled horsemen, warriors, and firearms. What they didn't have was a factory system behind them. The army had telegraph lines, railroads to move troops, and an effectively unlimited supply of superior weapons. It also hired native scouts from rival nations. And some of those troops were black. They were called Buffalo Soldiers. In 1875, the Army had about 25,500 men, and African Americans made up roughly 10% of the regular Army and 20% of the cavalry. They enlisted for what emancipation hadn't provided: a paycheck, literacy, a way out. Sit with that arrangement. Men whose own citizenship was being stripped away in the South were sent west to remove other people from their land. The West sorted people into positions, and the positions were assigned by whoever held the pen. The third thing, the decisive one, was the destruction of the bison. As railroads pushed west, companies cleared herds off the tracks, with professional hunters carrying high-powered rifles. At the same time, bison products became fashionable back east. Shoes, coats, hats. By the mid-1880s, hunters had killed more than 13 million bison, and the herds were nearly annihilated. For the Plains nations, bison weren't one resource among many. They were food, housing, clothing, trade good, and spiritual center. Removing them ended the possibility of independence. That's what forced people onto reservations. The legal squeeze kept pace. In 1884, the Supreme Court decided Elk versus Wilkins. John Elk, a Winnebago man, had left his tribe, moved to Omaha, and tried to register to vote. The court ruled that although he was born in the United States, he wasn't entitled to citizenship. The court ruled that although he was born in the United States, he wasn't entitled to citizenship under the 14th Amendment. Born here, living here, not a citizen. Not by accident, by decision. Now, the one genuinely hopeful parallel in this chapter, and it's a real one. On March 3, 2023, the Secretary of the Interior issued Order 3410, directing every bureau to restore wild bison and the prairie grassland ecosystem, explicitly with tribes, explicitly using indigenous knowledge. Funding followed, including $3.5 million for the Intertribal Buffalo Council. That council now represents roughly 89 member nations. In 2025 alone, more than 20 tribal nations received over 1,500 buffalo. Keep the scale honest. 13 million killed, 25,000 returned. That's not restoration in any complete sense. But the animals are managed now by the nations whose destruction was the entire point of killing them. They describe it not as conservation policy, but as sovereignty. What they didn't have was a factory system behind them. The Dawes Act is one of the most consequential statutes you've probably never studied closely. The mechanism: end tribal governance and tribal landholding. Divide the land into individual parcels, one per family head. Hold each parcel in federal trust for 25 years, after which the owner gets citizenship. Require, in exchange, that Native people abandon their ceremonies, their storytelling, and their medicine men. Then declare everything left over surplus and sell it on the open market. That last step is where the money was. Carve 160 acres per family out of a reservation, and an enormous remainder is left over, and the remainder went to speculators. The parcels families did receive were frequently arid and came without tools, seed, or credit. The arithmetic. A little more than a decade after Dawes took effect, Native people held about 77 million acres, down from about 155 million. Half of everything remaining, gone in 12 years, through paperwork. Then the children. Federal legislation in 1891 forced Native parents to send them to boarding schools. English replaced their languages. Boys got vocational training, girls got domestic skills modeled on white middle-class households. There's a first-person account in your chapter, and it belongs in this video. Zitkala Shah arrived at a boarding school in Indiana around age 8. She describes bells she couldn't interpret, shoes that hurt, a dining room where she sat down while everyone else stood. Then she learned the staff intended to cut the students' hair. In her nation, shorn hair marked mourners and cowards. A friend told her they had no choice, because the adults were stronger. Her answer: no, I will not submit. I will struggle first. They found her hiding under a bed. She was dragged out, carried downstairs, tied into a chair, and her braids were cut off while she screamed for her mother. She wrote later that this was the moment she stopped feeling like a person. Resistance took every form available. Parents insisted schools be built on the reservation. Families passed down languages and histories at home, deliberately, out of the government's earshot. And in 1888, a Paiute prophet named Wovoka had a vision. The world restored, the settlers gone, the dead returned. He taught a dance, the ghost dance, and it spread to thousands of Lakota. The Army read a religious revival as an uprising. On December 29, 1890, the 7th Cavalry pursued about 300 Lakota to Wounded Knee Creek on the Pine Ridge Reservation and killed roughly 250 people, many of them women and children. Black Elk, a spiritual leader of the Oglala, said it plainly afterward: a people's dream died there. In June 2021, the Interior Department opened a formal investigation. Led by Deb Haaland, the first Native American cabinet secretary in U.S. history. Volume 1 landed in May 2022, Volume 2 on July 30th, 2024. Together, they documented a system running from 1819 to 1969, identified 417 institutions across 37 states, and confirmed at least 973 child deaths. On October 25, 2024, at the Gila River Indian Community in Arizona, a sitting president formally apologized for the boarding school system, the first time in the country's history. Honest framing: an apology is not land, and it isn't a language back. Zitkala Shah published her account in 1921. The acknowledgement arrived 103 years later. But notice the report itself, the federal government investigating its own records and publishing what it found. That happened. It took 2 centuries. Money. One of the hopefuls was a young man named Samuel Clemens. He found nothing, gave up, started writing, and became Mark Twain. A reminder that the famous version of the West was often written by people who failed at the real one. Nearly half the men on those frontiers were foreign-born, many from Mexico and China. Here's the structural problem. A pan and a shovel only reach ore near the surface. The real deposits sat deep, and reaching them took industrial equipment nobody could buy alone. So Western mining stopped being an adventure and became a business. And prospectors became wage workers. In Virginia City, Nevada, miners earned $4 a day, barely enough to live in a boomtown. Shafts ran thousands of feet down. Working temperatures regularly topped 100 degrees. Cave-ins, fires, and floods of scalding water moved through the tunnels, killing or disabling thousands of men a year. Unions formed in the Comstock towns from the mid-1860s and won real gains. In 1893, miners founded the Western Federation of Miners, 50,000 members within a decade. And it excluded Chinese, Mexican, and Native workers. That's the pattern worth carrying. White workers organizing against their bosses while drawing a line around who counted as a worker. It comes back in Part 8. Boomtowns also had a reality the movies leave out. Women were roughly half the population, working long hours as domestic servants. And prostitution, which was legal, was the single largest category of paid female employment. By the early 1880s, the veins ran out. The towns emptied as fast as they'd filled. The industry shifted to copper, lead, and zinc. The towns that survived became cities sorted by class and ethnicity. Fast forward. Oak Flat, Arizona is sacred to Western Apache people and has been used for ceremonies for generations. It also sits on an estimated 40 billion pounds of copper, the metal every battery, phone, and transmission line in the energy transition runs on. The non-profit Apache Stronghold fought the transfer of that land to Resolution Copper. On May 27, 2025, the Supreme Court declined to hear the case. Justice Gorsuch dissented, calling the refusal a grave mistake. On March 16, 2026, the Forest Service transferred more than 2,400 acres to the company. The planned mine will eventually collapse the site into a crater roughly 2 miles across. 21 of Arizona's 22 federally recognized tribes oppose it. Same structure, updated inputs. A mineral the economy urgently wants. A community that's been there longer than the country has existed. The metal changed from silver to copper, not much else did. Worth reading what they're writing before the ink sets. No figure in American history has been marketed harder than the cowboy. Independent, armed, morally clean, defending the vulnerable from a saddle. Here's the job description instead. Cowboys were employees of large cattle companies, many financed by investors in England, Scotland, Wales, and South America, who hired professional managers to run the ranches from an office. The work was long, dull, and punishing. The signature task was the long drive, roughly 1,500 miles up the Chisholm Trail. The work was long, dull, and punishing. The signature task was the long drive, roughly 1,500 miles up the Chisholm Trail. George Duffield drove cattle from Texas to Iowa in 1866, and his entries correct every Western you've ever watched. Constant rain. A stampede that scattered 5,000 steers into other outfits' herds. Nothing to eat but bread and coffee. His own summary: "Dark days are these to me." Not homesick, he wrote, heartsick. And the crews weren't what the posters showed. Black and Mexican cowboys made up a substantial share of the workforce. Historians estimate black cowhands at up to a quarter of working ranch hands in the open range era, and they were paid. roughly 1/3 to 1/2 less than white cowboys for identical work. Jim Perry rode for the XIT Ranch in Texas more than 20 years. And he named the ceiling directly, "If it weren't for my black face, I'd have been boss long ago." Segregation traveled north with the herds. One white trail boss demanded a black cowboy eat and sleep apart from the crew and fired a gun at him when he refused. And Mexican vaqueros invented the profession. The equipment, the techniques, and the vocabulary traveled from Spain to Mexico to the Southwest and California. American cattle ranching is a Mexican industry. American cattle ranching is a Mexican industry with an English-language marketing department. The economics ran the same arc as mining. By the late 19th century, roughly 5 million Texas Longhorns grazed the region. Railroads gave ranchers a route east. Refrigerated rail cars meant beef could reach eastern consumers. Without spoiling, money poured in. Fewer than 40 ranchers controlled more than 20 million acres. Then it broke, overstocked and facing competition. And from 1885 to 1887, brutal winters and a scorching summer drought killed 90% of the cattle on the northern plains. Capital fled. The cattle barons went bankrupt, and what survived consolidated into bigger corporate operations. The cowboy ended the era as what he'd always been, a wage laborer. Two modern parallels, different in tone on purpose. The first is economic. On January 1st, 2026, the U.S. cattle herd stood at 86.2 million head, the smallest since 1951, per USDA data. The smallest since 1951. Drought, rising costs, and the return of the New World screwworm have kept ranchers from rebuilding even at record high prices. Meanwhile, 4 companies have accounted for more than 80% of U.S. cattle processing since 1995. That's the 1880s consolidation story still running. The second is cultural. In March 2024, Beyoncé released Cowboy Carter, built explicitly around the black cowboys the myth erased. The backlash told on itself. A genre that spent a century marketing an image of the West, insisting the people who actually built it didn't belong in the picture. Jim Perry said the quiet part in the 1880s. It took roughly 140 years for the industry to be forced to hear it, and it's still arguing. The Homestead Act of 1862 offered 160 acres to settlers who'd live on the land and farm it, free essentially, in exchange for work. You already know the problem, because Powell told Congress in Part 1, 160 acres wasn't viable in the dry climate of the Great Plains. Most people signing up had no idea, and the weather lied to them. The decade after 1878 delivered exceptional rainfall west of the Mississippi. Part of a wet and dry cycle that nobody arriving understood. The marketing was relentless. Railroads had enormous land grants to sell. So they advertised across the United States and Europe with wild exaggerations, ran discounted fares, and rented out entire train cars. The immigrant car, so a family could load possessions, supplies, and livestock together. Roughly 2 million Europeans came. Letters from settlers did the rest. Letters from settlers who'd made it work did the rest, which is the oldest referral marketing on Earth. With no trees, settlers cut houses out of the ground. Sod blocks, little light, insects and rodents through the walls. One resident's joke, there was running water in the sod house. It ran through the roof. Isolation was the defining feature. Homesteads sat far apart. A grasshopper plague stripped the northern plains. Summer heat alternated with winter cold that could kill you between the house and the barn. Women did the work. Women generated real income, taking in boarders, selling milk, butter, and eggs, which was frequently the cash the farm actually ran on. And a surprising number of women homesteaded alone, filing claims in their own names. That mattered legally. Land owned outright in a limited era. The politics followed fast. In 1887, Kansas women won the right to vote and run for office in every municipal election in the state. Homesteading is why. Then the math caught up. These weren't subsistence farmers. They were commercial producers, growing corn and wheat for a global market. When supply expanded, prices fell. Banks foreclosed. Almost half the homesteaders on the Great Plains gave up and moved. Speculators bought the abandoned land and ran it as big business. The recruitment pitch never died, it moved online. Tulsa Remote launched in late 2018, offering $10,000 to remote workers who relocate. Ascend West Virginia offers $12,000 plus recreation passes for relocating. It has brought thousands of new residents. Participants can leave. But look at the structure, a region with more space than people, a cash incentive, and a lifestyle pitch. Advertising aimed at strangers hundreds of miles away. It's the Railroad Land Office with a better website and, this time, honest numbers. Not everyone went west for money. The Mormons went for religious refuge and collided with the federal government on two fronts: polygamy, and the fact that Mormon doctrine treated farming as a communal enterprise in a country organizing itself around private property. The response escalated for 30 years. The church abandoned polygamy. Utah got statehood in 1896. And here's the detail that should stick. Utah voters approved women's suffrage in 1870, enfranchising more than 17,000 women, decades ahead of the country. Opponents argued they'd just vote the way their husbands told them, so the Edmunds-Tucker Act of 1887 revoked Utah women's vote entirely. 17,000 women lost the ballot. Then the people who were already there, Californios, Spanish-speaking Californians, were guaranteed property rights under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. In practice, they lost their holdings to squatters and a legal system operating in a language and framework not their own. 2/3 of all land originally owned passed to Euro-Americans. In New Mexico, Anglo ranchers began forcing families off land. Juan Jose Herrera organized masked night riders, Las Gorras Blancas, who demanded a free ballot and fair court. In 1889 and 1890, as many as 700 of them burned Anglo fences. Haystacks, barns, and homes. They lost. The Santa Fe Ring, lawyers and politicians, persuaded the federal government to grant them millions of acres. Mexican-American families had worked for generations. Mexican Americans remained a majority through the late 19th century, and Congress twice refused statehood. New Mexico became a state in 1912, once they were no longer the majority. Which brings us to the law that outlasted everything else. Chinese migration accelerated after 1840. People came for the gold rush, then for railroad construction. By 1880, the Chinese population reached 200,000. Then California's economy slumped, and white working men went looking for someone to blame. The argument was economic on the surface and racial underneath. Congress responded with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, banning Chinese immigration. It didn't stop the violence. On September 3, 1885, at Rock Springs, Wyoming, a mob of white coal miners killed at least 28 Chinese miners and burned 75 homes. Here's why this matters more than the others. When the act was challenged, the Supreme Court established the plenary power doctrine. Decisions about excluding foreign nationals belong almost entirely to Congress and the President, with courts largely declining to second-guess them. In 1890, the Census Bureau announced that the frontier line, the boundary marking where settlement thinned out, could no longer be identified on a map. Gone. Filled in. 3 years later, a young historian named Frederick Jackson Turner stood up at a conference in Chicago and explained what that meant. His argument, the frontier was the engine of American democracy and American character, because each wave of settlers reverted to primitive conditions and rebuilt civilization from scratch. In his phrasing, the frontier was the line of most rapid and effective Americanization, and he was worried because the line was gone. For most of a century, that was the story taught in American classrooms. Then in 1987, the historian Patricia Limerick published a rebuttal that reorganized the field. Her argument, the West is not a process that swept across a continent and stopped. It's a place and not a process, a region with a continuous history. Where Native America, Anglo-America, Latin America, Africa, and Asia met and collided. And where the people already living there considered their homeland the center of the map, not the edge of somebody else's. Notice what that does to 1890. If the West is a process, it ended. If the West is a place, nothing ended. The Muskogee Reservation is still there. The Colorado River still can't produce what was promised. Oak Flat is still contested. The buffalo are coming back one truckload at a time. Which brings us back to that table in St. Louis. He sold photographs of himself to people paying for a glimpse of a West that mostly existed in Buffalo Bill's arena, a show where Annie Oakley performed marksmanship for European heads of state. Notice the timing. When the 1890 census announced there was no frontier left, her popularity went up. People pay well for the memory of something the moment it's safely dead, and Geronimo spent his last years asking Washington to let him stand on the ground where he was born. He rode in a presidential inaugural parade in 1905. He was still a prisoner. The answer was still no. So here's the question this chapter leaves open. Every line in this video was drawn by somebody certain they were being reasonable. The treaty line, the reservation boundary, the allotment grid, the 160-acre plot, the exclusion statute, the frontier line on the census map. From the office where the pen was, none of it looked like cruelty. It looked like administration. So the useful question isn't whether people in 1877 were villains. It's this: what lines are being drawn right now around water, around minerals, around who gets to enter, around who counts as being from somewhere that will look this obvious in 150 years? Somebody is holding that pen today, worth knowing who, worth reading what they're writing before the ink sets.